Okay, welcome everyone to the first Books Week organized by the Department of Communications and New Media, National University of Singapore. I'm Jack Cho, a professor and also research director of CNM. Let me extend my warm welcome to you all, colleagues, students, and friends in Singapore, as well as from around the world, especially if you belong to our co-organizers, which are IAMCR's Communication Policy and Technology section, CPT, and also CCA, the Chinese Communication Association. 3 months ago, I had a conversation with my colleague, Dr. Weiyu Zhang, who happens to be CPT vice chair as well. She marveled at the number and high quality books about Asian digital media research in recent years, and I fully agree with her. Why don't we organize a series of events to discuss and celebrate these important books? This fantastic idea couldn't be more appropriate because at CNM, we emphasize studying communication and new media processes from Asian perspectives with global relevance. Another way to put it is to say we promote inter-Asian engagement with digital media scholarship. Now here we are on the first day of this exciting inaugural CNM Books Week. Let us begin very soon with a volume on Japan, to be followed by 2 books, one concerning India, the other China, on Tuesday, tomorrow. Wednesday, we will discuss Singapore in the morning and data feminism in the evening. Then on Thursday, we will discuss the business and politics of innovation in both China and India. All these time slots, are chosen by the authors, some of whom we have never met in person, like Dr. Marc Steinberg, our main author and speaker today. Yet it is amazing every single one of these authors said yes to us. And that includes Dr. Kate Crawford, who cannot join us this week, but we will discuss her new book, The Atlas of AI, on August 18th, a month from now. For that, please stay tuned. Some of you may still wonder, why books? Isn't it a trend that academic publication has been only about journal articles? To this, we respectfully disagree. At CNM, each colleague has her or his mixture of research output formats. I, like many others, publish both articles and books. True, the publication field has been skewed towards journal articles, which is precisely why we need events like this to strike a better balance and maintain the intellectual biodiversity, so to speak. Books are uniquely important because they deal with big problems requiring book-length treatments, which is especially valuable at times of crisis, like this COVID moment of our time. Unlike journals operating within the confinement of academic subfields, books target interdisciplinary and public readership. Books require more labor, more attention, and more citations from our collective practice of inter-Asian referencing towards a more organic intellectual community of Asian media and communication scholarship. With this, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to all book authors, to all colleagues, Weiyu, Tabaris, Ozong, as well as colleagues at IAMCR and CCA who helped with the organizing. Many thanks to CNM colleagues who volunteered to serve as discussants for the important books of this week. Special thanks to our student helpers and admin team, especially our PhD student Chang Wen, who provided essential logistical assistance, and Zicheng, who designed the posters and the virtual backgrounds. How beautiful they are. Now I can stop share my screen. Yeah. So now it's my tremendous pleasure to introduce to you our main speaker and author of tonight, Dr. Marc Steinberg. He is Associate Professor of Film Studies at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, where he also serves as Director for Graduate Programs, both MA and PhD in Cinema Studies. Marc is an expert of Japanese popular culture, anime, and games. He specializes in media industry studies, especially in Japanese and Asian context, and the political economy of digital media, focusing on the rise of digital platforms in particular. He is the author of the award-winning book, Anime's Media Mix, Franchising Toys and Characters in Japan, published in 2012. And now we are very much honored to have him discuss his more recent book from 2019, The Platform Economy, How Japan Transformed the Commercial Internet. We will first ask Marc to revisit his new book and reflect on its main arguments and contributions. Then I will provide a short discussion to be followed by open floor Q&A. Please feel free to type your questions and comments into the dialog box and share it with all participants. At the very end, we will take a group photo together with Marc. For that, we will need all of you to use our official virtual background, and Changwen will share the file in our dialog box later. So thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming, and over to you, Marc.
Thank you so much, Jack and Changwen as well for organizing this and inviting me. Thank you everyone for coming. It's a real honor to be here, and it's really wonderful to be able to discuss my book, which, as Jack said, I really appreciate your introduction, Jack, because of the importance of books in thinking about what the sort of intellectual ecology is right now. So what I'm going to do is, let me get my Word file so I stay on track here, is talk for about 15 to 20 minutes about the book, including the background of writing it, some of the central arguments, discuss some of the structure and what I see as a couple of the blind spots of the book, and if I have time, end with a brief discussion of some more recent work that I've been doing that comes out of a book, or this book rather. So the aim of this book was to write a kind of media history of platforms and the internet in Japan, and also contribute a theory of how corporate transformations are fueled by language. So this is really taking an approach that's less focused on the economic alone, and how language itself is part of the kind of ecosystem that constitutes capitalism. And there are two main points to this book. That the internet history of Japan remains to be written in some ways. There have been great books on the sort of history of the internet in Japan, but those were more around the 2000s or around keitai or cell phones. But it seemed to me that a new one had to be written in the sort of platform era. And that this would give us the tools to better analyze the platform economy, or what we now call platform capitalism. And maybe parenthetically, I'll say that when writing a book, as Jack noted, it's a long process. I started it probably around 2013, 2014. And it was over the course of that the term platform capitalism really came into prominence, and this is something that I think I address in the book, but we can address more afterwards. So how did I get here? My first book, as Jack noted, was Anime's Media Mix, and was really on the anime industries and media franchising, or character merchandising, media franchising, convergence culture in general. But it was an attention to this word media mix itself that got me interested in the way words or language shapes media practices. And this was something that propelled my own work. And while I was finishing the media mix and then working on what became a Japanese translation of the book, that I had a chance to do more research on, especially the company Kadokawa that I talk about a lot in this platform economy book, that I became interested in the way contents as a term was kind of replacing other sort of media-related terminology, and the way platforms were also becoming a preoccupation to people in the media industry itself. So one of my main questions in writing the book was really, and this is one of the earlier titles of the book, was what is a platform? So what is a platform was my original book title. Titles are negotiated always with presses, and they changed over time for the better, I think, but that remains a sort of central key driving question through the book. Over the 2010s, so 2010 onwards, platforms became an increasingly important part of vocabulary in North America, but also Japan and really everywhere else that I looked. And also at the same time, we see a transformation in Japan's internet, landscape, where we see a decline of the familiar flip phone, which was sort of the centerpiece of media consumption in Japan, to smartphones, and one of that was on my mind. And I'm based in Canada, and we had BlackBerry, as you may or may not remember, and BlackBerry is also going into kind of terminal decline, and Apple and Google with Android and iOS were becoming the dominant phones and operating systems of our era. And that kind of media dominance and eventually media imperialism was also something that occupies me throughout this book. But in dealing with platforms, I was also struck by how much, and this has changed recently, but how much at the time, and even to some degree to this day, Silicon Valley and really North America and the United States are presumed as the center of any kind of platform discussions. And I'm really heartened to see how much is transformed over the past, I will say, just like 2 or 3 years. Jack's work is a real precursor to this. So I have to say that he was a model in even thinking about this platform economy book. And there's been a lot of work by people like Julie Chen, who I know is a collaborator, and others who work on the platform economy in China. So there's a real transformation now. But at the time, my aim, and one of my aims in this book, is to recenter platform discussions away from Silicon Valley. So to answer the question, what is a platform? I came up with 3 different types or typologies of platforms. One is a very hardware-centered, game consoles, computer hardware. 2 is something like social media. So social media giants like Facebook or YouTube are what I call contents platforms. And 3rd is the transactional model of the platform, which are economic models for things like credit cards or the Apple Store. And one of the things that particularly interested me about the transactional model, which is one I give kind of center attention to in this book, is that it offers a mediation theory of the platform that I found was missing from the communications and media studies I was reading at the time, which was very focused on hardware. And I'll note here that because I come from a film and media studies background, slanted more towards film, I came at communication studies and particularly internet studies with many blind spots. And I kind of welcome a discussion of like, what are the blind spots of this book? What are the literatures that I'm not engaging with? So in writing this book, one of my projects was really teaching myself what internet histories were, what internet literature there was. And I recognized in doing this that I also missed a lot. But at any rate, the transaction model in what I was reading was really missing. And the transaction model is something like the two-sided or multi-sided markets that come out of management theory that describes instances of something like YouTube that is free for users to view videos, but that sells advertisements at the same time. So that's a two-sided market, at least, where the user has free access, but the user is also sold as their data and so forth to platform to advertisers. Sorry. So Along the course of writing this book, there also the Nick Cernicek book, Platform Capitalism, came out, which sort of offers this term platform capitalism as a way of centering thinking around platforms. And I could say also that I'm both in agreement that there is a new era, but also that this era has transformed over a longer period of time. So one of the things that I focus on in this book is in particular Japanese transactional management theory that starts in the 1990s and the rise of the mobile internet via iMode, which is one of the main services that offered the sort of mobile internet from the 2000s onward. Or 1999 it starts and then really picks up into the 2000s. And let me sort of skip. So the account is very focused on Japan, but I treat Japan in relationship to other parts of the world over the course of this book. So first of all, Japan and the US as a sort of comparison between their platform and contents discourses. Second of all, Japan to the global via the sort of mediation of Android and iOS, which really pick up on iMode and Japan's mobile internet services and export them to the world. And then Japan in relationship to the East Asian region, particularly China and South Korea are my foci here, with a comparison to WeChat, on which Jack's written a fantastic book, KakaoTalk, and Line. What we can now call super apps, but of course there are other ones like Gojek that have taken off since then and that offer us a way of thinking something like a platform specificity in the Asian region, or sort of inter-Asia platform specificity. So here I want to turn to the structure of the book. The first part of the book really deals with language and discourse, and the two terms that are the foci here are contents, which I think is, content usually is the way we would talk about it in English. It's pluralized in Japanese, and I argue there's a kind of a lineage from the media mix that makes this pluralization significant. And then platforms, and there's where I go through a typology of platforms, lingering in the third chapter on this management theory platform. And I come out of a concern with management theory in part because I was also at this time that I was writing this book, co-editing a book, Japanese or Media Theory in Japan, which was trying to rethink where media theory happens and who is responsible for it. So I was interested in thinking about, okay, are these management theorists also proposing a kind of theory of mediation? And if so, what are the technological preconditions of their theory itself? And also thereby rethink something like the history of theory, where there's too often an assumption that Silicon Valley is the center of all the innovations in the digital sphere, and it's sort of west to east sort of trajectory, which, from this story and many others is not true. I then shift in the second part of the book towards industry practices or media industry players. And the first and the sort of most central one is this NTT, which is like the National Telecom of Japan iMode service. And this I view as sort of the most important platform development in Japan, and also the reason for the title of the book, From Japan, How Japan sort of commercialized the internet, and really influences and impacts iOS and Android, as I've already said, but even the kind of habituation to a model of paying for things on the internet, which was something that was really in contrast to the free internet that came before it. Free, but advertisement supported. From iMode, I moved to Dwango or Nico Nico Doga, Nico Nico Video, which is a video service whose importance maybe has declined in recent years, but was influential on Bilibili in China, and the kind of an aesthetics of interface that contrasts a lot with the kind of transparency of interface that I see in Netflix. And so this is where I turn to my sort of film studies background to draw on some debates in film theory about transparency versus opacity, and the sort of writing of comments over the video in Nico Nico is something significant. And finally, I end with a kind of conclusion coda that engages with what are now called super apps. I'm referring to them in this case as chat apps. I would call them super apps now, WeChat, KakaoTalk, and Line, that require us to think about a kind of Asian or inter-Asian development of platforms that I think really are influential today. So I'm going to skip a bit. One of the things I also wanted to come to, I guess, in this book is by focusing on management theory, creating a different aperture for media studies scholars in reading about and thinking through media development. And the turn to management theory, I think Jack in his review is very kind about it, but the criticism of this book could be that I give them, the management theorists, a little too much credit or focus on them too much. But I think there is an importance to situating management theory work in their media context. So many of the people that I'm writing about who are talking sort of from the management theory industry or economists are impacted by changes in technology that as media theorists we're concerned with, like the rise of VHS, the eventual rise of the internet, but that they treat it in a more unconscious way. And in this way, return to some work that I think was really interesting, kind of critical area studies work of the 1990s. And I'm thinking here of Arif Derlich in particular, who were reading management theory and kind of critical area studies together. And maybe finally, one last word on the book itself is that I've always, been taught by, my friend and teacher, Tom Lamar, that books are always provisional, that, you never finish a book, you abandon a book. And I think this is true, very much true for the platform economy, where after a certain point, I was like, okay, it is timely, it is roughly finished, and I think it's time that it see the world, even if it's not the last word that I'll have to say about any of this. And so, sending out a book into the world for both, junior and senior scholars, I think is always a trying exercise, and it's maybe a stressful one, an exciting one in other ways. So just to acknowledge that books are always unfinished, and this book was unfinished and kind of remains to be done in some ways. And that my work since then has really benefited from conversations I've had with, in fact, a lot of Jack's collaborators who I'm co-writing a book with, or I've co-written a book with, Media and Management, Radviza Andreasevich, Melissa Gregg, and Julie Chen especially, who have shifted my attention to questions of labor, which are really absent from the platform economy book as it is right now. And to thinking about longer histories of manufacture, which is, again, one of, I think, the strengths of your work, Jack, for instance, Goodbye I Slave, that focuses our attention on factories. And that's something that this is, that is newer for me and that I would like to work towards moving forward. And maybe as a final note on this, two recent essays that came out of mine. One is about Line as a super app, but thinking it again in terms of this regionalism. And the second one is about sort of the trajectory from automobile capitalism to platform capitalism. So taking up a thread I have in this book that that is there, but I don't do as much with as I could, and really focusing on what it would mean to rethink platform capitalism in relationship to automobile capitalism, and how, in fact, we are very much within the kind of the rubric of Toyotism, even if so much seems to have changed. So a kind of questions of continuity and breaks that I think this book calls attention to, that I think we all need to always think about whenever new terms like platform capitalism, platform economy, and so on arise. So on that note, I'll stop my kind of introduction. And thank you again for your invitation, and welcome kind of comments, critiques, questions, and anything. Thank you.
Domo arigato. Thank you, Mark, so much. You know, you've been that was a very systematic, but also humble. Okay, you know, summary of the book. And let me just warm things up. Okay, for more discussions. Okay, I think I know half of the people in the audience just from the names, and some of them are much more of a Japanese. Okay. Media scholar. Okay, I forgot all my Japanese except Tomo arigato. Okay, and so I'm just going to warm things up. Okay, for more in-depth discussion. First, I definitely think okay there's no better way to start the week. Okay. Than what we're doing today. Of course, Mark just happened. We gave every author the whole week for them to pick the time, and Mark was the first one who picked the first day. Okay, but then this book, okay, I think is really groundbreaking and exemplary work in tackling issues of platform economy. Okay, and also more specifically, two puzzles that our colleagues and PhD students often face. In CNM, we are a Department of Communication and New Media Studies. I often hear colleagues and students complain to say, new media studies, okay, is so easy to be outdated, right? Before we finish writing even an article or even the blog entry, okay, things have already changed. How can you write a book, okay, that can stand the test of time? A second complaint I often hear from around me, including senior colleagues, is to say, when we write about Asian communication research, okay, how can it be recognized by people from outside Asia, especially in the West? Okay, so I think in both ways, okay, this book, okay, addresses, okay, for the first question about new media studies, okay, withstanding the test of time. Okay, you've done an excellent job of historicization. Okay, so the first answer to the first puzzle is that we need to historicize, like you talk about it, like around the year 2000, there was a boom in, I think it's now known as Japanese cyber culture studies, right? And there were so many buzz around the time, and then it disappeared, right? You know, and there's Mitsuko Ito's book. Okay, everyone was citing, and then nobody returned to it. So there's a prehistory to the current, okay, problem, okay, that is in the platform economy. And then answer to the second question about Asian communication research with global significance is that there needs to be contextualized. There needs to be contextualized alternative. Okay, not it's like you said, you know, the Silicon Valley hegemony. Okay, in the way we understand and research platform economy, I find it to be such an imprisonment. Okay, so when I was reading this book for the first time, around this time last year, I found it to be a jailbreak for myself, right? And I hope, I think that's something other readers probably will agree with me, that we recenter, we decenter, okay? And in the process of constructing, right, and rediscovering, okay, Japanese platform economy. Now I'm calling it JPE 1.0. Okay, Japanese political economy 1.0. That's what you call the I mode effect. Okay, which however later on evolved into JPE 2.0, which is Dangoism. Okay, the Danmu. Okay, all this. Okay, so there are evolution, but 1.0 is so different. You know, even though I think towards the end of the book you say the Dangoism, okay, Duangoism, okay, the 2.0 Japanese platform economy model is actually a continuation. It's I think you called it simply a different model of Cernisac's platform capitalism. Okay, however, the JPE 1.0 is actually very different, because it does not depend on advertising or predatory collection of data, all right, of user data, but it's actually about curating and fostering contents, okay, contents that you already talked about. Okay, so here we can see the JPE 1.0 as a model that apart from, all right, Silicon Valley model, okay, although we are talking about what is the PRC, the China's model, okay, or from Silicon Valley to Shenzhen, okay, or early on there were discussion about the European model. Sometimes it's also known as the Finnish model. Okay, I think the JPE 1.0 model, that what you call as I mode effect, is actually more comparable to the European, Finnish model, which you may, I'm not sure whether you would fully agree, because there's a welfare state. You know, in a case, the NTT, okay, is less predatory. Okay, it only takes 9%, okay, out of the transaction, not only because it can make more money out of data, right, traffic, but also because it's not as it's partially state-owned, right? Can I say, or it's like this traditional socially responsible, okay, you can say Japanese corporation that provides, of course, that kind of model is an extension of, so this is where I'm a little not clear, okay, because when we talk about Fordism, okay, I don't know enough about Japan. Okay. Fordism, instead of, besides what is discussed in this book, all right, Fordism actually has to grow in the context of Keynesian, okay, welfare states. So in what way is the JPE 1.0, the I mode, and do you see it as also building on, okay, on top, okay, or embedded within the Japanese welfare states, okay, around the turn of century? Okay, what is the role of the governments? Okay, because you mentioned many times Cool Japan. Okay, the government initiative to promote Cool Japan is a very important factor. Okay, but what about does the I modes, okay, when they have their paid contents, okay, walled garden, where it's not only I mode but also Easy Web and J-Sky, they actually help the content providers to make better ringtones, to make better games, okay, or to increase the quality, right? And then go on to their IPO, okay, in the stock market, for example. So I'm a little unsure whether the welfare state plays a role there, okay, or there's a maybe there's an absence, okay, because there are, I think there's an old article by Nelson, from Media Culture and Society, talking about Sonyism, okay. This was more than 10 years ago, and they were talking about is the failure of Japanese welfare states. Therefore, they promote this multimedia, industry as a solution, okay, to the stagnance, the post-90s, okay, stagnance. So, in what way is welfare state, Japanese welfare, related to it or not? So that's my the question. I'm still not sure. So here, maybe, because you were talking about the original title was what is platform, right? And now it is called the platform economy. I'm not sure whether it will be better to call it the platform economies, okay? Because from I mode, okay, the 1.0 version to Durangoism, okay, there is already lots of change. You mentioned, right? Is the Durangoism is actually more precarious, okay, in terms of the creative labor, okay. Whereas in I mode, the creative labor are much better protected, even grown organically. Okay, so this is my first big question. All right, whether there's it's better to consider platform economies in the plural. And my second part has to do with Toyotism, right? And usually when we talk about Toyotism, it's lean and mean, all right? Yes. The kind of flexible capitalism. I really love I did not know about the pre-digital version of Japanese platform being in the Toyota car manufacturer that you just already, so I learned that's a illuminating point for me, right? And but I still as a critical scholar, even though I know the public general opinion in Japan tends to see Japan as one entity, but as critical scholars, we are trained to question the inclusiveness of the model, and women, for example, right? Toyotism is notorious for its sexism, right? But then in I mode, from what I remember 20 years ago, one of the main founder for I mode actually was a female editor of a popular, like a women's magazine. Yeah. Right. So in a way, is the if we just only talk about JPE 1.0, is it more genderly inclusive? To have all the female workforce included, and what about LGBTQ? Or other minority groups, from the Burakumin, to the Korean, to other Chinese, Iranians, for example, are they included, in the kind of I mode effect? Or it seems to me that the Duangoism, that when you talk about Nico video, actually celebrate more of this subculture. So in this way, JPE 2.0 is actually more inclusive than 1.0. I just want to seek your, whether my reading is correct or not, right? And even today with Duangoism, are there still critical boundaries, right? And I've got a bunch of questions, to follow on this one, but maybe I'll just stop here. I think I already have 3 big questions. Yeah, first is the role of the state. The second is should we call it singular or plural? Platform economies within Japan, and thirdly, the social division lines. For those who are benefiting, who are included, or who are marginalized in this platform economy formation.
Thank you. Those are all really, really generative questions, and I really like the JP 1.0 and JP 2.0 distinction, because I think you're right that ultimately Duango, while drawing a lot from the iMode subscription model, depending on it really, and not really caring as much about data, is more still in the YouTube paradigm of user-generated content and relying on a kind of unpaid labor for its production. So, but maybe, so I'll try to tackle your question. So the role of the state, it's a really interesting question, and I haven't honestly thought that much about it, but there are these discussions, and one of the questions, maybe to your second question about economies, was whether there's capitalisms, and there are these interesting debates, as you probably know, many know, about capitalisms and whether East Asia has its own form of kind of capitalism that is, let's say, less based on sort of ideas, at least, of competition that are supposed to drive capitalism in the United States, let's say, and NTT. So the kind of driver of iMode was a state company until I think 87, 88. Even after that, it was a public company, but it had this kind of mandate to behave in a kind of socially responsible way that we don't necessarily expect of companies like Google, Apple, and so on. because of its legacy of being a state-owned and state-run company. And going to your question about gender parity, at least, the inclusion of Matsunaga Mari is like one of the few female entrepreneurs in this time, as you said, is something that really interested me and that I didn't discuss as much, but seemed like a nice counterbalance to the often very dude-centric, male-centric tech world that we are used to, at least. And that she came from magazines was also interesting to me because it goes to the importance of contents as part of that story. So there's all reasons why her presence is quite important. But you also see people like the founder of, it's called DNA, but it's written as Dena, D-E-N-A, who also was, engaged with EasyWeb and JSky, and she ultimately became a really important player in the mobile games environment. So I think there is something to say about the role of the state, and I'd have to think more about this, and a kind of a different model of capitalism. And I went back and forth about the capitalism's question because, on the one hand, there are people, like in the critical Asian studies lineage, like Harry Hartunian, who say there's no such thing as alternative modernities, there's only capitalist modernity. And there's a way that kind of makes sense, but when you actually see it on the ground, you see different modes of capitalism developing. And I think of a recent really interesting article about Alibaba, and that sort of, I forget how she put it, but it was about a kind of, sort of family-oriented capitalism where, there's this sort of smaller enterprise model that's very different from the large-scale monopoly corporation model that we associate with kind of the ravages of capitalism in the US in particular. So the comparison with Finland is interesting, and there is a way in which the state is ultimately very supportive of the NTT company, and NTT internalizes a kind of responsibility into its mandate. So the fostering of content producers is one of the interesting aspects of this. So they take a 9% cut rather than the 30% we're used to. And they, as you said, they foster content production rather than try to sort of have a free-for-all that we associate, again, more with Google and Apple. The economy as plural, I think, is interesting too. I wonder maybe if you could say more about that. Is it because instead of one platform economy, there are sort of different models of economies that move on through time? Yeah.
Yeah, especially between I-mode effects and dualism.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. And, maybe I emphasize a little too much the continuity story. I sort of foregrounded this question, is there platform capitalism? Because it's also important to always say, well, am I making claims that this is a new era, and thereby, suggesting disjunctures rather than continuities? And so in this story that I tell, I emphasize continuities and the sort of trajectory, but at the same time, there are these transformations, even between the I-mode model and the, iOS Android model. There are significant changes in terms of business operations and the economies, as you're saying. So I like the idea of suggesting or reframing it as two economies.
Yeah, and another angle to this is because you also mentioned in chapter 5, you're also discussing the platform imperialism. Right?
Yes.
So that's the relationship between Japan, the Japanese model, and the Silicon Valley model, right?
Yes.
So I think this another division line among historians of Japan, okay, before the stagnance of the 90s. I think it was between S.L. Vogel, who wrote Japan is #1, and also Chalmers Johnson, who wrote the book about strong army, okay, and a rich nation, strong army, right? So Vogel was actually taking the Japanese modernity, or both of them would see Japan as a version of capitalism. Okay? But then the geopolitics, the relationship between Japan and the US is rather different. Vogel is seeing Japan as a model to be emulated. Okay, even the US may evolve, or all the management studies was teach American corporations to be more Japanese. Okay, Toyotism, right? But then Johnson actually was seeing Japan as a potential, not as bad as China today now, maybe, okay, but potential, okay, challenge, okay, to America's global leadership, okay, at least in the, so there's a inter-capitalist, clash between the Japanese, okay, Toyotism and American Fordism or post-Fordism. So I think making it economists can also bring in the Japan as one of the modernities, okay, or as as a contending force that cause clash within the capitalist world system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Chalmers Johnson was one of the people I was thinking about when I was thinking about the capitalisms as well, because he's had this model of MITI, the Ministry of Trade, essentially always collaborating with industry and ensuring that industries collaborate rather than compete, and that this was against the kind of model of a winner takes all kind of capitalism that we have more from the US or neoliberal version of capitalism. So it's true that from that lens, NTT is really in the model of the collaboration rather than competition. I guess I would just say that another interesting figure, you mentioned Koreans in Japan, is Son Masayoshi, who's the SoftBank founder. And if we're thinking only about at least the top level, there is this moment where, and Son is like one of probably the most visible and important of figures, and a very controversial one, and a sort of funny one at the same time. Who's a Korean Japanese, and who went to the US, and had early investor in Alibaba famously, and part of Yahoo, but who owned SoftBank, and SoftBank is one of the major carriers in Japan. And so this story is also an interesting one, and that evolution from SoftBank as a essentially a software distributor to a telecoms company, to now being essentially a finance firm or investor, venture capitalist sort of model, that, and reading even the kind of backlash in tech writing against SoftBank is also seeing the anxieties about a US dominated coterie of small firms that run the venture capitalist market, vis-a-vis this sort of outsider who is throwing too much money around. And so even that, I think, signals a kind of sort of fissions or gaps within ideas of how capitalism is supposed to be played.
Right. Has anyone written a good article on SoftBank? I think, because I think it's like a cat has many lives, right? SoftBanks must have so many different stages. And to the latest one with WeWork, if people are following, the scandal, okay, Masayoshi Son was taking money from some of the worst human rights abusers in the Middle East, right? And then uses to grow super apps around the world. So in a way, SoftBank, and especially Masayoshi Son's most recent SoftBank, probably is Japanese like a JPE 3.0, which is even more neoliberal, more Silicon Valley than Silicon Valley, right? But in a way, his intellectual upbringing actually was in Berkeley. So he is a
Yes.
Silicon Valley guy too. So in a way, this shows the complexity and the global, relevance of the Japanese model. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I wish someone had written an article. One of my next projects was supposed to be to write an article on SoftBank. So I had people gathering information, and the way that SoftBank is investing not only in Silicon Valley and WeWork, but in South Asia, Southeast Asia, it's just a really interesting player that sort of shows that venture capital doesn't work in nation-based models that we think about. So
definitely.
I think it also, is a kind of challenge to understandings of how finance works as well. So I think I missed the singular plural. Yeah, so if that's a starting point, at least I think the Matsunaga Mari is really interesting. And then the economies is definitely a kind of a point that I'd like to think forward with, because I think you're right that there's transformations that are important to bring out. And I told this, this narrative that's somewhat continuities over time, but that there are these important transformations that you're drawing attention to.
Can I ask one last question, before we open up? Anyone, after this exchange, please feel free to unmute yourself, or you can type your question and comments in the dialog box. Okay. So my last question is about method. The way you do your research. Of course, I admire your Japanese. Okay, to read all the trade magazines to analyze the discourse. But can you describe to us? Because when I was studying Chinese internet, I actually collected, tons of trade magazines that I discarded. I feel, bad about discarding them when I was moving to Singapore, in part because it's so hard to go through, and I find it to be so boring. Okay, literally, where it's much more interesting to compare, to look into like the Chinese cadres officials' speech. I can interpret them more, maybe because I had a little more training, in political rhetoric, okay, vis-a-vis management studies, right? Because I have zero training in management studies, right? So can you, how did you collect the Japanese trade magazines, and also do you do it online now? And then how can you overcome, sorry, I have no better word. That must be kind of tedious, okay, boring work to go through, the corporate discourse.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. And I honestly, I've kind of talked about my book in a kind of PhD class context, and one of the points I make is be prepared for boring work, because that's what this is. I feel like the outcomes are important, but and again, I come from a film and media context where a lot of people focus on texts and exciting films or great manga or interesting anime series. And the really important thing for me is to take that broader context, and that's not done through analyzing specific things that might excite us, but in fact through the very boring and tedious. And so one of the ways, for the first part of the book especially, was looking through what are called white papers, hakusho in Japanese. And they're like you're saying, they're kind of trade journals. They have an ambiguous status where a lot of them are produced by either major companies, like the advertiser Dentsu had one about, I forget the title now, I think it's called Contents, and even the names change over time. There's other ones about computing and computer histories. So when I wanted to look at when does the term contents come about, when does the term platform start being used, and how does the usage change over time, I was mainly looking at these hakusho, some of which I was able to buy, but most of which where I just had to go to the library in Tokyo University or the National Diet Library in Tokyo that collect these, and that you just go through kind of each magazine, looking at the table of contents, how that changes, seeing quickly going through at least the text to see if those words are being used, the context in which they're being used, photocopy them and take notes, and that, the mundane work that you're talking about. And when possible, buying some of the older versions of these, but they have a weird, they're kind of like gray papers. They are public, but they're not public, they're not so publicly consumed. And but they're good indicators, I think, of a kind of industry discourse for me. And that was a way in. Industry meets government, because some of them are commissioned by government. A lot of them are commissioned by large industries, like, again, the computer societies, or the advertising agencies. And then the second part of the first part of the book, so essentially chapter 3, was really a kind of happenstance where I was looking through, and this is when I got more into the management, cued into the management as a site of thinking about this. And I had no training really in management either. So this was, me doing the best I could, but I found an interesting article that was an overview of the platform concept. And it was by 2 Japanese management scholars, one of whom turned out to be very important, Neguro. And in that article, they do the kind of literature review that positioned the Japanese, that talked about articles from 1993, 1994 about the platform economy, or platform business, they called it, that were really crucial and eye-opening. And from there, I went to their, from their bibliography, I went to the original sources, started contacting the authors of those who were happy to talk about it, and confirmed with them that they were probably some of the first to really talk about what was called the platform business, what they had coined as the platform business. And so that was, the chapter 3 was a combination of just fortuitously talking to a media economist, a friend of mine who mentioned this management part, and then going back to the literature, finding earlier examples, contacting some of the people. And so this part could be done online. Like there's a limit to what could be done online, because the Japanese library is strangely, restricts access to even materials that they've scanned and are uploaded on their computer systems for some unknown reason. But then other ways are via just reaching out to people and hoping for the best. And sometimes people will respond and sometimes they will not. But this was the way I slowly made my way through. And with the management literature, I'll be honest that I would read sometimes the introductions and conclusions and not really understand the sort of mathematical equations and everything in the middle. But what was interesting to me was the framing, especially in the beginning, and especially the contextualization of why they were doing the work they were doing. And that was helpful. And so I would say that this is, and could be, very boring work, but that maybe going back to one of your earlier points that I really appreciate, like I take it as a huge compliment, is like how historicization is important, because it also, this builds on your economy suggestion that historicization is also a way of seeing different possible futures and other possible futures. And I was doing this work at a time where Google and Apple seemed like the inevitable conquerors of the world, and the platform imperialism hypothesis is very critical, but also sometimes reaffirms that very dominance. And so how to unearth kind of lineages or other possibilities that are different from the present that we're living in, and kind of help us imagine a kind of a different future. And in this work, history and historicization is incredibly important. And our work always changes and feels, let's say, less relevant as things move along. But by even thinking about the present as history, it may help your students especially think about how to work on the present without feeling trapped by it, and the movement of the sands of the present, that everything changes so quickly.
Absolutely, yeah. And while you work on this white papers and on Earth, okay, going through the archives, okay, and the discourse, you also unearth some of the really precious, most precious gems, okay, which to me the most precious gem is that metaphor, okay, the palm of Buddha. Okay, so this is to the beginning talk about platform economy. So this is a Buddhist metaphor. Okay, so from those of us who grew up in Buddhist, okay, literature, we know this is talking about the universalism, all right, and also no matter how naughty, how powerful is the monkey king, okay, he can never escape, okay, from the grip of the Buddha. I think that kind of metaphor, okay, it really is powerful and inspiring. Okay, that can, because after all, the concepts are metaphors, right? Yeah. I think going back to Buddhism, maybe Taoism, okay, or other Islam in other contexts, we can uncover new lenses, okay, to talk about the presence and also to see the problem of the present. Yeah. Okay, I think that's maybe enough for our back and forth. The floor is open. Anyone want to unmute yourself? Yes, Wei Yu.
Mark, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes. Okay. Hi, Wei. Yes.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, and I really enjoyed reading your book in the last several weeks. Right. Oh, so, yeah, thank you. Jack just mentioned one metaphor. I like to share another metaphor that really left a very strong impression on me when I was reading the book. Let me read it out. I already quoted in one of my current papers I'm writing on. So you mentioned that this metaphor, right? So the partner terms, platform and contents, right? You said with Shakespeare rebranded as a content creator and bookstores retroactively termed platforms, right? So I think that's a great metaphor. And that's a great metaphor that shows how ridiculous maybe our nowadays platforms are. So if you think about business models, right, you would think that it's extremely ridiculous if the book writers, right, like Shakespeare himself, will get nothing from selling the books. All the profits will go just to the bookstore, right, the platforms. So this metaphor makes me think about, again, I think one of the very brilliant contributions of this book is the typology of platforms and how you always link it back to contents, right, when you talk about platforms. So using that metaphor, I'm imagining, right? So like you, especially the second and third type of platforms. The second contents platforms, I can imagine it's more like maybe some social media companies that might be similar to Netflix, which means that there is a stake for the company to produce a high quality content. However, that is defined, right? Could be defined as market needs, right? Yeah. Then we have the third type of platforms that's purely mediational and transactional. And that makes me think about the Chinese, emerging Chinese platforms such as TikTok or Douyin in China. They have very little investment. They have a very little stake in producing content. However, they have full control over how the content flow to the audiences, right? And their profit making, their business model is based entirely on this transaction, control over transaction, right? So my question to you really is, I felt the third type of platform is very dangerous, compared to the traditional culture industry kind of companies that do pay attention to contents. So I would like to ask you, Mark, you probably are aware of both history and what's going on now in Japan, right? Speaking of looking for alternatives, right? Do you see alternatives to the third type of platforms. That's purely mediational and transactional. And will the social media industry be able to find a new direction? That's a less evil model, right? I would probably call it, right? So that's really my question to Marc, right? Thank you so much, Marc.
Thank you. I guess, yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. I'm glad the Shakespeare popped out at you, and as did the bookstore. So I think the way I'd answer the question is, I really frame the mediation model as a way of capturing users in a market transaction, right? So that ultimately it's a mode of encirclement. Like once you're interpolated as a user in this transaction model, there's sort of, you are managed as much as you manage your device, right? So end user license agreements are ways that devices manage us as much as we manage devices or use devices. And so it's this kind of two-way street of managing and controlling users. And so is there a different and more, like, let's say, politically progressive way of thinking about this? And maybe one thing I would go to is, and it's not like without its own problems, but the free software movement was one of the models that I don't talk about in this book, but was one of the models for one of the authors who I discussed in the late 90s, Kimura, who was interested not only in the commercial aspects of the platform business, but also in the kind of progressive parts of the internet that that he saw emerging, and he kind of fixated on the the open software movement, where the exchange between people that's mediated by, let's say, a platform is not as clearly defined in financial transactional terms. And so I think one of the ways to think about this, because there's other ways to say, well, essentially platform cooperatives still work through this mediation model, but they just cut out the financial kind of motive for that transaction, or the kind of skimming off the top, creating surplus value model of transaction, and instead highlight, let's say, the socially progressive parts of the cooperative, that in fact it's about the common good, and it's about doing things together outside of the the Ubers of the world, and outside of WeWork and all of those, to think about transactions differently. So even though I frame the mediation style platforms as essentially always capitalistic, I don't think that is necessarily true, and that there are other models of thinking how the mediation model works. And even if we think back to the Jack's comments earlier about iMode being a kind of a place that harbors and kind of tries to raise content producers in some kind of more gentle and productive way, that also is like a different model of the economy, let's say, than the kind of rush towards the bottom, extract the most value model, from which we observe maybe TikTok, YouTube, other forms of platforms today. So I would like to say that yes, there are, and we have to think about it, I guess, as non-extractive or non-extractivist platforms that use mediation for other purposes. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Thanks for your great question, though.
Any other questions? Or
hi, Marc.
Hi.
So I really enjoyed your presentation and reading your book. So it's really very fascinating book that I've read in recent times, and a lot of interesting things that came up. But what fascinated, as it also follows from previous questions from Wei-Yu, is about the transactional model of platform. And this also in relations to what I have been seeing a lot of empirical research recently done by Reuters Institute of Journalism. And globally, it shows that there is people are still not reluctant to pay for accessing content. And if you look at Japan, which is very fascinating that you highlighted in your book, that here there is an emergence of a model which is more transactional in the sense that users are willing to pay. And I think Japan is one of the country where users are more likely to pay for the content they consume online as compared to other countries, And so that's what fascinates me. So looking at this, what do you think would be the future of platform economy? Do you think this transactional model, which is emerging from Japan, which is paid content, is going to be popular? And will it also lead to more extraction of capital, because platform economy is so powerful, because it's not like capital intensive in the sense that other kind of capitalism, as the heavy industry dependent capitalism, it generates a lot of employment. At the same time, it's also extract capital. But here, the extraction of capital really disproportionate to the generation of employment or other kind of subsidiaries benefits that is attached to capitalism. So my question here is, what do you see the future of platform economy looking at what is happening from Japan? Does it help in predicting what is coming up, or is it very peculiar to Japan and may not be replicable to other parts of the world?
Thank you. Thanks for your question. I think it's an excellent question. And I really saw, I guess during even the time that I was writing the book, I saw a shift from really expecting everything to be free on the internet, at least, it's sort of from a Canadian, North American perspective, to being willing to pay for news services. It took maybe the election of Donald Trump for New York Times to get many readers paying for their news, but that was a helpful shift. And so I guess in that way, I'm a media studies person and recognize that, media production and journalism is not free. And so that we need to, pay to support our, our journalists and our media production. And so one of the maybe, positive aspects of this spread of a more Japan model of, paying for contents is that ultimately, now we subscribe to particular services. Do these services adequately pay for the contents they're getting? So Netflix, do they pay their rights holders enough, and so on, are important questions. But I do see at least in the, let's say, streaming sphere, which I'm looking at more, the sort of video streaming, whether it be TV or films at this point, there is greater employment because of a demand for content. So for better or worse, that there are these, these kind of employment effects that, as you note, like that generally, for companies like Facebook or Instagram was sold, I forget for how many billion when it had 17 employees. So there was a way in which you only needed 17 employees at one point to be a multi-billion-dollar company. Now I see the kind of push towards, even on Facebook or social media firms, to have proper content moderation. Where that moderation takes place is a huge question, of course, but that there is an increasing acknowledgement that there can't be just no moderation, no payment, and sort of no and very small companies or let's say employment. I think a lot of the employment tends to be outsourced. And so, Jack was talking about Toyotism earlier. And, one of the things that Toyotism is not always acknowledged to have produced is a sort of a model where everyone who is in the company is generally full-time employees. Everyone who's outside of the company are generally precarious workers, and that Toyotism was based around like 30% of things were actually produced in Toyota, 70% outside of Toyota, and that 70% were, contract workers, essentially, and often women or minorities in Japan. So there was a precarity that goes against the kind of narrative that we hear about full-time employment in Japan and so forth. So, and now that, you know, Google is essentially using the same model and other tech companies are as well. So sorry, this is a long way of answering your question. I think there is more a tendency to pay for news, for video content online, but then there are services that still use that default model of kind of free contents, and this includes some newspaper companies, but the recent Australian deal with I believe it's Google and Facebook. There's in Canada as well, there's a push towards this, and Google recently signed a deal with a number of major Canadian newspapers, for instance. And so I think there's going to be a push for more compensation for the news content that people are producing. Similarly, I think there's going to be a shift towards paying for online video. And to me, this is positive so long as we support the kind of news producers and also film and video producers, many of whom are my ex-students in Montreal. Thank you for your question. I hope I answered it, and sorry for the long-winded reply.
Yes, if anyone have question, please feel free to unmute. Okay, or I have a question actually also related to this.
Can I?
Go ahead, Hongmei, you go first. Yeah.
Hi, this is such a great presentation. Thank you so much. And first, I have to acknowledge that I don't have time to read your wonderful book, which sounds extremely interesting, but I look forward to reading it. So I have two questions. One is the tension between the state and capital, and so I think you talk a little bit about that, and Jack also asked the question about the role of the state. So I just wonder if you can comment a little bit more on that, especially now. So on the one hand, the states we've seen like various states or political entities that really try to curtail the online world and platform economy. And so one example is for example, like Didi recently, right? And when they went to the US for being publicly listed, and then the Chinese state said that it had to really go through such kind of security check. And so obviously it experienced like a huge challenge. And another is that it seems like the European Union really treats like data differently than the US, right? And then so we have to, users have to opt in. And so the question is, who owns the data, and which factors can really shape the configuration of the platform economy? Because on the one hand, the global capital wants to be free, right? And so it does not really want to be bound by the national boundary. But on the other hand, the state and political entities still try to intervene. So just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. That's the first question. And the second question is, I want to ask a follow-up question about the future of the platform, and especially how do we evaluate the platform economy in relation to consumption and overconsumption. And so recently, because of social media and a lot of platform economies. And fashion, for example, fashion companies are able to produce contents in a much quicker, right? And so for example, like fast fashion brands such as Zara, H&M can really produce products like in a week. And so this is in contrast with the past, where you see like fashion really goes in cycle like 4 seasons. And so this creates huge problems for consumption, overconsumption, and environmental issues. So I just wonder if you can talk a little bit more about how do we really situate the issue of consumerism and in the broader context of the platform economy and the ecology of digital economies. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Home. Maybe I'll just talk a bit about your second question first, and then come back to your first question, because I really, I've been thinking lately, you frame a lot of this through the platform economy. A friend of mine has been using the term data capitalism a little bit more than platform capitalism, and what I appreciate about that term is that, in fact, it draws our attention to the longer history of data usage within capitalism. And my recent work has been on Toyotism, and so just-in-time production, which is really a data-fed or data-dependent mode of manufacture. So what I like about your question is it's asking us to think about the environment, but also about production, the way platforms affect other kinds of production apparatuses, in this case, fashion. And I think there is a way that the platform logics, like including just-in-time, affect other, fast fashion, and include this sort of speed up that has, as you rightly say, this kind of huge environmental consequences. So maybe just a sort of methodological response first is that it's useful to think, as you're doing, to sort of think data capitalism rather than just platforms, because platforms, their effects spill out of platforms themselves. I mean, Zara was fast fashion before the rise of, let's say, Instagram, but I think I've also understand that they've accelerated, to now, as you say, like 4-week turnover cycles, and so prototyping and so forth. And this is just going to create more environmental catastrophe. So I have to think more about how to answer this in a productive way, rather than just agreeing with you and saying this is an environmental catastrophe and how do we stop it. But that maybe what you're suggesting is really that this sort of platform economy has to be examined for its consequences outside of platforms directly, and that there's been a lot of work and important work on kind of data trash and this sort of the where do our electronics go, but there hasn't been as much that I've seen about the environmental extra device consequences of the platform economy. So I think that's something that's really interesting, provocative about your question. And just rereading recently Slow Violence, which is really interesting. How do you make the kind of environmental consequences visible where there's time scales at which generally environmental consequences don't happen immediately? So that that also brings up how are things hidden by Instagram posts or something like that, and how to make them visible. So not an answer to your question, but just to say your question is really generative for thinking about all of these crucial issues that are really like, we have just got over COVID, but COVID, as we know, is linked to environmental change. And so it's only going to accelerate. And Western North America is under immense fires right now. So yes, environment is kind of the common determinant of so much. And state and capital, I think on that is a little bit more like of a bright side for what's going on right now. There was, a sort of 15-year period, at least 20-year maybe, where regulation was essentially non-existent. And I've been going back to the the critiques of monopoly capital, particularly in the US context, and reading the sort of classic monopoly capital book and other works that are around the sort of railroad barons and the sort of essentially rapacious capital in the US in the 1880s to 1890s, the transformations and the rise in regulatory actions by the US state. So it's, sorry for this being US centric, but there is, there are movements within the United States, as you say, within Europe, that EU preceded this with the Data Protections Act. I find that China, the IPO of Didi and the scrutiny of it, I don't know, I haven't read enough, but I don't know how to read it, whether it's an attempt to push Chinese companies away from US IPOs or whether there's another, aspect to it. But that suggests like this what's called the splinter net and these sorts of, the breaking down of kind of an internet that along the lines of this US-China, essentially reproduction of a Cold War. And I think maybe I'll just say parenthetically there too, that it's important to analyze different platforms outside of the US-China, binary in a way, because we also need to think about, what's dropping out of the cracks of what's so much a focus on US versus China right now in the press, in even the techlash. There's somehow an alignment of a lot of English language media against China, and there has to be some kind of recognition that there are other players. Like, so I ended up focusing online, partly because I work on Japan, but partly because I think it's a useful way to complicate the platform's narrative. Gojek could be interesting too. The other examples abound. But I think it is an interesting moment for this state capital tension insofar as, with something like Cool Japan, there's this real alignment with state and capital where they at least ostensibly have similar end goals, but the pushback against the large tech firms in multiple parts of the world is probably a good step in the right direction. And so that, I hope that tension increases rather than decreases, I guess, and that alignment breaks up, because there has been too much of that of late. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right, we have still a few minutes before we wrap it up. Let me just ask my last question, okay? Because Singapore, we are a very forward-looking country, all right? And so I've been thinking whether I should recommend, okay, my colleagues, okay, in Singapore to say, when we consider Singapore's digital future, we should learn from Japanese platform past. Right, but whether I should make that recommendation depends on your answer to my question, to this last question, right? And so, in what way? Just now, like you also said, I simplify it as the I mode, okay, JPE 1.0, okay, which is an ecology of care, right, where the platform care about the worker. Okay, foster their work, in the long term, in a way. But then, is this too romanticized? I'm very, because in a way, because your data, okay, from the trade magazine, from I think you did some interviews. All these are from the elite, the industry leaders, not from the actual people, right? Who were in the I mode, okay, ecosystem. Right, yeah. And also I'm asking this question also with another very important background knowledge about the crisis of the Japanese corporate man, okay, like Toyota, like everyone is well protected, they know their retirement, okay, all these things, but it's actually a model we all know from the Japanese films, okay, thousands of them telling us, those guys, they hate this model. there's no attraction, okay, for the old, okay, corporate men, okay, hierarchical, as predictable as they are, but the people don't like it. Okay? And so in that way, when 1.0 move into 2.0, into Duangoism with the Danmaku, okay, Danmu, all this, okay, yes, the labor become precarious, and they are probably teenagers or college worker or college student who leave, because they have rich parents, okay. But at the same time, I'm imagining maybe the exploited, precarious, okay, creative labor of Duangoism, Nico video, they actually love their precarity more than the Toyotist, or iMode, labor, hates their boring corporate man life. Okay, so what would be what is the I know I'm asking too much. Okay, you've done so many things already, right? But is there any evidence, okay, from your archival research, or have you talked to, okay, some of these people who were involved in the iMode effect themselves as grassroots participants rather than the industry leaders?
It's a fantastic question. So I guess maybe your first question was, should you recommend this or not? And maybe the easiest way to answer is to answer with the caveat that yes, you should recommend it, but with the caveats, that
of course
it was. I agree with you that it was an ecology of care. There was this kind of attention to content producers that is significant, and that fosters people. And I do see the production of iMode as being something as how to think about a user-centric model. On the other hand, and I haven't done enough research on how users thought about it, but it was very difficult to unsubscribe to something once you've subscribed. So just one small example that, if you would want to unsubscribe to something that you're in a monthly subscription on, and it's 10 o'clock at night, that you wouldn't be able to, or you would have to go through 10 different menus to in fact get to the unsubscribe button. And so there's a way that there was this kind of lock-in effect, and users were not allowed to do what they wanted. And this in part was one of the reasons why there was a shift, I think, towards the smartphone, which offered a new form factor, and the kind of techno-fetishism of the Japanese consumer allowed for this to take hold. But also there was something else, and it could have been that there was a general fatigue with the restrictions placed on users in iMode. So I think that's one thing to consider. And the other thing to say is I haven't done research on device production in the way you have on let's say, the iPhone. Like, how were these devices produced? What were the conditions? What were the labor conditions? And that ultimately would be an important part of a proper answer to your question. And I guess I agree with you that the needs, the non-employment or education or training, the people who are part of Duango also enjoy not being part of that corporate system that expects uniformity and sameness and all of that you identify as being part of the sort of Japan corporate past that's very masculinist, and that there are things about Line. I think Line offers a somewhat interesting model too, where they offer, again, like there's problems and they take a large cut, but the sticker producers for Line are interesting in that they offer better, let's say, fostering of those sticker producers than I think like Instagram might for its influencers. So a long answer to your really good question, but I think, with the caveat, I think there are aspects of this ecology of care, as you've nicely put it, that are worth considering and thinking about moving forward. and that, you know, there is a way that so long as we're within a system of capitalism, there is a way that there's a more benevolent form of capitalism that supports, you know, workers in, you know, in a more progressive way than we see at work in the sort of Google, Apple duopoly.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I think that's also sounds like a good project. One of the PhD students in this room. Don't tell other people, okay? If you want to, you can do some oral history, okay, interview that can answer this crucial question to compare from 20 years ago, okay, iMode, okay, to you know, Nico video and Line today. Okay, I think that would be a fantastic you know, oral history project to compare.
That would be, yeah, absolutely. I agree.
Thank you so much. I think with this,
yes.
Yeah, may I invite everyone to, if you are ready, okay, to take our group photo, please turn on your camera, and it will be fantastic if you are also, everyone, okay, if you can have the virtual background, please put it up. Otherwise, it's okay. We will take it without the virtual background, yeah. I hope everyone have enjoyed the discussion today, and if you have not finished reading the book, or you have not even bought the book, okay, you should go and buy them and make sure Saskia, you know, Shakespeare survives.
Thank you all for your fantastic questions too, and for everyone who is listening. Thank you for coming and listening. I realize it's late at night too, so I appreciate it a lot.
Oh, thank you for coming, you know, so early in the morning. Yeah. So should we take a photo? Yeah, like Changwen, can you, yeah, can you say 1, 2, 3? Yeah.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, keep smiling.
Oh, by the way, I have something in my hand. Can you see it?
Oh, wow, yes. It looks like an iMode phone, yeah.
Yeah, so this is actually my wife's old phone, Japanese phone. So this is the quintessential. This was the 1.0 I'm holding in my hand.
Oh wow, that's so interesting.
Can you see it? Yeah. So it has a physical button which you can press and go on to Yahoo Japan. Yeah.
Okay, it's a SoftBank phone.
Yes.
Amazing.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Okay. Thank you, everyone. So tomorrow we'll at 2 p.m. Okay, we will be talking about the politics of digital India, and then in the evening 9 p.m. Okay, these are all Singapore time, right? And 9 p.m. tomorrow we'll be discussing the other digital China, about activism and non-confrontational civil society in Chinese cyberspace. All right. So see you tomorrow, and thanks again, Mark. Thank you everyone for coming. Yeah, let's put our hands together for Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
And thanks again for all your amazing questions.
See you. Thank you. Bye.